Okay, hi everybody. Good morning. Why don't we get started? So yesterday we saw that we saw a differentiation in halacha between whether the tax collector is an employee of the king or whether he purchased the rights of collection, which we don't really have anymore, but which existed in the medieval world. Let's go on to the next halacha, Yud Zayin. Melech, and then I had foreshadowed this in the Gemara that we saw yesterday from Bava Kama Daf Kuf Yud Gimel. Melech Shekaras Ilanos Shabali Batim. So this goes to the issue of eminent domain and you being able to utilize property that has been confiscated by the government. And we'll talk about this more in the next two halachas. Melech shekaras ilano shel balei batim va'asa mehem gesher. If a king cuts down the trees of a certain landowner and he builds a bridge out of those trees, so even if this was against the will of the owner of the forest whose trees were cut down, mutter la'avor alav, you're allowed to still cross the bridge. You're allowed to benefit from the bridge. Afilu tziva lichros mikol echad be'echad davar yadua, v'holchu shlucha v'karsu hakol me'echad. And this is true even in a situation where the king, we had seen this in the Gemara, had told his royal contractors to cut down trees in different properties, and they went ahead because of their desire to economize on labor, and they just cut down all the trees from one area and decimated the forest of just one owner instead of cutting down the trees from multiple places. It's still mutter. It's still permitted to use that bridge. Lefi sheshliach hamelech melechu, because anyone who's an employee is a proxy of the king, and the proxy of the king is like the king himself. And since the king himself has the right of eminent domain to be able to take whatever he wants for the public works, he's permitted to do that. And therefore, it's not incumbent upon the king or his proxies to add to their effort by traveling to different parts of the region to get wood from different places, but rather they have a right to cut down trees in just one place. And if one person's land was decimated as a result, then the other landowners should feel that sense of indebtedness because they're all citizens of the same, or they're all subjects of the same kingdom, to compensate that one individual, and each one should pay for the loss of property from their money. So either they should give him other trees to plant, or they should pay him for his loss, but there should be a sharing of the loss by all of the subjects of that region. And it's a very vague statement, but that's the attitude of the Gemara. The Gemara basically says, since the king has a right of eminent domain to do whatever he wishes, it's up to the subjects of the kingdom to help out their fellow subject and make him whole if the king sort of blazes a path or takes away his trees. Aval im karsu ilanos shalomi das hamelech ba'asu gesher. But let's say a group of people go ahead and cut down trees without permission of the government, without governmental granting, without the king giving them this permission, but just, a bunch of strong arms go ahead. And you can imagine this happening in a third world country, in Africa or South America. A group of guerrillas go ahead and they confiscate property and build a bridge for themselves without any official government sanction, ba'asu gesher, and they build a bridge. So then, asur la'avor alav, ela im kain misaruhu l'rabim. You're not allowed to even walk on that bridge because it's stolen property, unless this property is given over for public use. In other words, it's no longer a privately owned bridge, because if it's a privately owned bridge, it's still in the possession of the Gazlan, and there's been no shinoi rishus, there's been no change of ownership. But once a Gazlan steals something and changes ownership by giving it to the public, as long as the original owner has had yeush from ever retrieving that wood, so then you're allowed to benefit from it. Because in that sense, it now becomes publicly owned, even though originally it was stolen, because the original owners of that wood have had yeush, and it has changed hands from the Gazlan to the public. Because through it being given over to the public, they have acquired it through the public actually beginning to use it by walking over the bridge. Okay, so that's the basic halacha, and as the Imrei Yaakov points out, mutter lavor alav, you're allowed to walk over this bridge. Rotzalomer delohavi gazlan ragil shabo nisbar le'el sif yud yud aleph to asur lehanos mizeh. The shiny hacha denasai de melech debo kaimelandina de malchus adina. We don't attribute the bridge to be a stolen bridge because it was done by the king. The king has eminent domain. And asur lavor alav the afal pisha asa mehen gesher mikol makom havi shinui maisa shechozu lebriyaso sheino nikna. And the Imrei Yaakov basically says over here that we're talking about, and by the way, he says this more thoroughly in the Biurim, which we won't take a look at, but he basically says that we're talking about wood which may have been just lightly sanded down, but it's like a log bridge. In other words, we're dealing with logs. So the wood has not substantively changed from its original state when it was stolen. And because of that, there's been no shinoi maisa. There's been no real change in the state of the wood when it was stolen. And that's the reason why you need shinoi rishus, because as we learned before, even if it's still in the possession of the Gazlan, but the Gazlan actually changed its physical form by cutting it into a piece of furniture or something like that, so then that also makes it permitted to benefit from as long as the owner had yeush. But here it's a little bit worse because the wood is still clearly identifiable as the original wood that belonged to the victim. And therefore you have to wait until they give it over to the public for use before you can benefit from it. Okay, and achar shenis yashu, but you can benefit from it only after the owner has had yeush. Dafka achar shenis yashu, aval shinu rishus ve'achakach yeush lo moel kidle el sif yud aleph. That's only permitted. You can only transfer the ownership from the Gazlan to the public after you've ascertained that the owner has had yeush, and then it works, as we've explained previously. The yeush b'shinoi rishus v'afilu noda hagzela kodem shinoi rishus, and this is true even if it was discovered to be stolen property before it was given over to the public. B'shinoi rishus umari shasu es hagesher meha'itzam mibli l'shafosam. Yeah, he says explicitly that we're talking about a bridge that was made from wood that was not finished. It was unfinished logs. The imshifan harei nishtanu l'shinoi she'enu chazur l'briyasam v'az ein tzarech l'shinoi rishus, because if the wood was stolen as logs and then was sanded down and made into lumber, so then even without giving it over to the public, you'd be allowed to benefit from it by virtue of the fact that it has been altered. And in that situation where the wood has been changed into lumber, you'd be allowed to benefit from it even if the owner has not had yeush. Actually, yeush is only necessary if there's no change to the original item. But if there's been a change to the original item, then even Yeush is not necessary, and we'll see that later on in Sif Chav Gimel. Bihilucham alav. Once the public begins walking on it, that demonstrates that they've acquired it for the public and it no longer belongs to the original people who cut down the trees. Mashma the dafka sha'ayidei zeha b'shinu rishus, aval imrak amru shehi mosrim zil rabim adam lo nikna lahem. And the Imrei Yaakov says that it seems like they would have to make a physical walk across the bridge to make it, and that it's open to the public in order for this to be considered to be public property. Just making a declaration that it's public property before people walking on it is not considered to be Shina Rishus, is not considered to be a change of ownership. Okay, so that's that halacha, that you're allowed to benefit from a bridge that was made from stolen property, provided that the original owners had Yeush, and provided that the public, it's given over to the public. Okay, but again, we're seeing an example of eminent domain where the king or his proxies have a right to confiscate property of an individual subject in order to build or in order to benefit the public works. And we're going to see a little bit more clarification of this in the next halacha. So let's take a look at the next halacha, halacha Yud Ches. V'chein melech shaharas batim v'asachoma oderech. If a king goes ahead and he demolishes houses because he needs to build a wall, okay, or he needs to build a road, and it's a very common thing even in today. We talked about the Allen Expressway. I think Ron had mentioned the Allen Expressway yesterday. There is a law of eminent domain that exists on the books even today. So if he demolishes homes to build a wall or to build a roadway, mutter lehanospa, you're allowed to benefit from that wall or that road, v'chein kol kayotze bazeh, and any other kind of situation where the king either confiscates or destroys individual property for the purpose of creating a public utility. But that's provided that the king's currency is currently the used currency in the land, meaning that he's recognized as the king, because whenever you use a dollar bill or you use a loonie or a toonie, you see the king's name on it or his face on it. Because in that situation, the citizens or the subjects of that land have basically agreed that he is their ruler and he has the rights of eminent domain, and that we are subservient as his subjects to his rule. She'im lokain arehu kegazlan balzroa v'chol avadav gazlanim. Because if the king is not recognized as the king, right? Let's say he's in the medieval world where there was always drama in the monarchy, right? And the old king dies, and then two of his two sons are fighting to see who's going to become the next king. And King James and King Charles are fighting it out with each other to see who's going to become the next king. And in the course of their fighting, King James goes ahead and confiscates property. Well, he hasn't been coronated yet. And if so, then he's just a Gazlan. That's basically what he's saying, right? Or when you're dealing with unstable governments in third world countries, I guess the same thing would be true as well. There has to be consensus that this is the king. Okay, so I just wanted to show you something in the Biurim, which I find to be quite relevant, where he tries to explain what eminent domain means, because there's three different reasons why a monarch would confiscate property for the purposes of eminent domain. And it's an interesting point that he makes. He says, "O derech mutter lehanos." If he builds a roadway, you're allowed to benefit from that roadway. So he writes as follows. He quotes the Rambam He writes, Kasav HaRambam Perakei Mehilchos Malachim Halacha Gimel. The Rambam writes in the Laws of Kings, and this is a very important section of the Rambam in the Mishnah Torah, which we will probably come back to multiple times, but it's also an important part of halacha dealing with government structure. And the Rambam writes, the Melech Poretz Lasos Lo Derech Ve'ein Memachin Biyado. Famous statement that a king is allowed to breach a pathway on someone's private property, and no one is allowed to protest. The derech hamelech ein lo shiur, ela kefi mashu hu tzarich. The king, you cannot restrict the width or the girth of the king's roadway. He's allowed to make the road as wide or as long as he wants. Eino ma'akem hadrochim mipnei karmo shel zeh o mipnei sadeu shel zeh. And the king, you cannot force the king to curve the roadway so as to circumvent one person's vineyard or a person's field. The government has the right to make a straight roadway without having to inconvenience the public. Elaholech b'shaveh va'osa milchamto ad kan l'shana. But rather he can breach the path straight away and wage his war. And that's the way the Rambam ends the halacha. He can use it to wage his war. And so once the Rambam says those last two words, there's an implication over there that perhaps this is only permitted because the king needs it for his militia in order to protect the borders. So, and that's what one of the commentaries on the page of the Lechem Mishnah actually suggests. He says, "Lechem Mishnah Sham Hevi the Das Rashi Sanhedrin Chafam et Beis the Bechol Esus Man Afilu Shelo Letzarach Milchama Elo Letzarcho Bilvad Osakain." Lechem Mishnah points out that Rashi has a variant opinion. That Rashi says that a king is allowed to confiscate property and build roadways, even not during wartime, but can do it for his own needs. Okay. Avoldas Rambam shekasav elaholech b'shav va'osa milchamto mashma de mefarsh the davka heicha the tzarch hamelech l'milchamto hu osa kein avolo l'tzarcho. So it sounds like from the Rambam that the Rambam would disagree with Rashi and would say that the king is only allowed to forge a path on private property if it's for the needs of waging war for the country, for the kingdom, but not for his own personal use. You know, let's say the king has a palace and he wants to create a road that gives him easy access to the marketplace. And in order to build a road from the palace to the marketplace, he needs to go through private property. So it sounds like that this would be the area of machlokas, that according to Rashi, it would be permitted for the king to do that. But according to the Rambam, it would not be permitted during peacetime to go ahead for the king to build a road purely for his own convenience. So that's what the Lechem Mishnah writes. The problem with the Lechem Mishnah is that if you're creating this binary choice between the king building a roadway for war versus a king building a roadway for his own personal use, and those are the only two choices, then you have a problem based on the halacha that we've just cited over here, which is not from the laws of kings, but rather from the laws of Gezela. And this is what's being quoted in our halacha over here. The imharas batim va'osa osam derech ochoma mutar lehanosba, that if the king wants to build a roadway or wants to build a wall around the city, then you're allowed to benefit from it because it's not considered theft because the king is within his rights. V'chein kol kayotze bazeh shedin hamelech din ad kan l'shana, because of dina de malchusa dina, because the subjects have accepted the king upon themselves as their monarch, and that they subjugate themselves and their property to the needs of the monarchy, to the needs of the government. And therefore it sounds like that even not during wartime, but any time, a king has a perfect right to go ahead and build walls and build roadways on private property. The Harekan, Lomairi Bishas, it's clear that we're not talking about necessarily wartime in our halacha. So he says that there's a third option. He says, "V'yesh lomer dekan mari harambam shahaderech nasa letoelas harabim, v'lachen yesh b'zeh dina de malchusa." So he says it's not binary, it's trinary. That's a word, and that what's going on is that there are three different scenarios. One is to build a roadway during wartime for the king's army. Two is to build a roadway for the king's personal convenience. And the third is to build a road for the public works, for public utility, not during wartime, which is what we're discussing over here. So the real differentiation that needs to be made is not whether it's wartime or not, but rather, is it for the king's personal use, or is it for the use of the citizenry, of the public use of the people who live in that area? He says, and that's the real difference. But if it's for the king's personal use, then there would be no permission based on eminent domain law. Ba'ayin Tosfos Sanhedrin, and he just gives us references to other sources where we can verify this information. But the point of the matter is that this, I guess, would be true even today. If our beautiful Prime Minister Justin Trudeau were to choose to build for himself a roadway for his own convenience to go from what's the address on Essex Street where he lives to get to Parliament Hill, and he wants to build a more convenient path for him to go there, but he's got to demolish a private home in order to build his road. So then we would say, Mr. Prime Minister, yes, you're the Prime Minister, but your rights of eminent domain do not apply to your own personal conveniences, but rather to the needs of the public. As much as you feel that you can use your government position for personal gain, but there's only so far that we're going to allow you to do that. And I hope everyone's catching my tongue in cheek over there. But if he needs to build a roadway for the public welfare, so then that's where Dina de Malchusa, the laws of the land, have to be respected, and there's no concept of theft when it comes for the king to build a roadway or to build a wall or to build any other thing that is perceived by the government to be for the public good. Now you're going to see that this is going to become an issue in our own neighborhood because we've just been approved for the subway extension. That's going to be coming up to Thornhill and up to Richmond Hill, and they're going to be extending the subway along Yonge. And there will be situations where I believe the government today probably has to compensate people for loss of property. I would imagine so. That's probably a law. But technically, al pi halacha, if the government wanted to function according to Jewish law, they would not even need to compensate people whose land is being confiscated and or destroyed in order to be able to build the subway, because the subway is a public utility. It's for the public good. And therefore, if you happen to be the poor unfortunate soul whose house has to be demolished or whose field has to be demolished in order to allow the train to go up north, then so be it. And that's just your unfortunate lot. Okay. Now, would it perhaps be necessary as a convention for the rest of the subjects to compensate you for that loss, like based on the last halacha, where the king knocks down all of your trees instead of taking other people's trees? That perhaps would be so. But eminent domain does not place the onus on the government technically, even though in the Western world, it's considered to be convention that the government does pay for the property that they end up destroying or confiscating for the sake of public works. I remember there being cases in the United States of, one guy being the final holdout for the building of the new highway, or the new road, and they had to finally build around him. But that would only apply if it's a private road. And I guess maybe that might be a difference between a road, let's say Highway 407. Is that owned by the government, or is it owned by a private company? Does anyone know?
Partial.
It's private. That one's private.
What's that, Barry? It is owned privately?
I'm pretty sure it's privately owned, yeah.
It is now.
Yeah, so I mean, that would be an interesting issue, is that, there could be certain roadways that the government just gives a contract to allow a person to build, but then they have to compensate people fair market value for their home. And if they can't arrange at a negotiated price, they have to just walk away or build it around that person. Okay. All right. All right. This is a lengthy piece about whether or not the law of the land is the law applies in Eretz Yisrael, or if it only applies in Chutz La'aretz. So I think we're going to save this piece, Mirz Hashem, for next week. Any questions, comments before we finish for the day? So I think what we'll do is we'll hold it here. Wish you all a good Shabbos, and we'll see you Bezrat Hashem on Monday of next week. Okay? All right.